No, I'm not here to talk about how hot Shyvana got with her rework or whether she lays eggs. What I actually want to talk about is the fact that Riot mentioned the 3rd season, giving us a bit of information about what it might look like and leaving 2 possible directions it could go. On top of that, even though 2026 is bringing a lot of new things, we already got confirmation that it's going to be very stagnant when it comes to new characters. Yeah, it looks like the people who kept criticizing Riot saying they only know how to release increasingly generic and recycled champions while not updating older ones or even worrying about fixing the huge list of bugs the game has will now have to deal with it or find something new to complain about. During the latest dev update released on February 2nd, in the Q&A section, someone asked if we could get a new champion in Act 1. Rioter Meldler responded that we wouldn't because a new character would only be introduced during the 2nd season. I'm actually going to leave a short clip of what he said right here because there are a few things that need to be explained.
Is there a new champion coming for Season 1?
No, we're not going to be doing a new champion in Season 1 of this year. We're focusing instead right now on the large update to League, the one we'll talk more about after MSI. We will, however, have a new champion coming out in Season 2, who relates to the thematics of both Season 1 and Season 2.
Yeah, remember the second to last dev update where they talked about a massive overhaul the client is going to receive with the promise of improving the game a lot? With what Meldler said, it becomes pretty clear that most of the resources are being heavily invested to Project League Next. Earlier in that same Q&A session, they also asked the following.
Can you bring Twisted Treeline back?
Not working on this right now, but I'll be real, we'd like to someday. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as just flipping on a switch, as some things need to be entirely rebuilt in the League engine nowadays, but it is something we are excited and nostalgic for, so maybe.
And man, it's obvious they wouldn't try to bring back 3v3 right now. Riot probably doesn't even have the files for that map anymore, just like Dominion, which was completely forgotten by players and only got a bit of attention when Riot ran the Ascension event. Besides that, both modes are extremely outdated and way more connected to the old lore back from the days of the Institute of War. Not to mention, they're working on this new engine, because the one they've used for League is basically garage level technology. Has it improved over the years? Yeah, but if you compare League to a lot of other games out there, it's honestly embarrassing for a company that grew so insanely fast over the last few years to still rely on something that archaic. And it's no use trying to say or make videos claiming Riot is bankrupt and that League is dying. It really did go through a rough phase, but think of it like a roller coaster. Sometimes it's at the top and other times it's down low. But before we keep going, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and consider becoming a member. You'll get access to some really cool perks like picking video topics or getting early access to videos. But going back to that 3v3 topic, it makes absolutely no sense to develop and rebuild the map from scratch for the current version of League, which is basically this giant mess of code and errors, only to have to do even more work later when they have to redo everything again on the new engine. When he says 3v3 might maybe come back, it's pretty clear that would only happen around 2027 or sometime after that, when League Next is already up and running. The same thing applies when it comes to new champions. In the case of Locke, it's very likely his development was already further along compared to other champions. And yeah, Riot doesn't develop champions one by one, they release them one at a time, but most of the time, their production timelines overlap. But getting back to the point, so this year doesn't go by without a release. Locke will be arriving, just not right away. And even in Season 2, don't expect the character to be added in Act 1. He'll most likely show up somewhere between Act 2 and Act 3. That should happen closer to the middle of the year. People have already been circulating this post from Meddler, which basically repeats what he said in the dev update video, but adds a few extra bits of information. And it kind of confirms that Locke will probably be the only champion we get this year. It's also worth mentioning that he talks about the possibility of us seeing how League Next is shaping up, but only after the MSI period, which is that annual international tournament that always happens around the middle of the year. The last one ran from June 27th to July 12th. Meddler also says this discussion could happen sometime around early 2027, and that it will depend a lot on how the project is progressing and on player feedback, meaning the players who will be invited to test League Next. And yeah guys, Riot actually invites well-known players to get their opinions on certain things. Usually there's a contract involved where you agree not to leak anything you see or learn about, so yeah, we already know they're never inviting Big Bad Bear. Speaking of invitations, we even saw that being shown in the dev update video.
So throughout the process, we brought a wide variety of her mains out to our office in LA to give us feedback on her gameplay, her art, and everything in between.
And since we're talking about reworks, Medler also confirmed, without going into too much detail, that there's another rework currently being worked on. It actually makes sense for us to get another rework, otherwise the gap between the new releases would leave us without any content for many months. I already have a strong guess about which champion is going to get reworked in the 3rd season, as well as the region where it might take place, but we'll talk about that a bit later in the video. Now, about Locke. It was mentioned that there will be a small connection between Season 1 and Season 2. Basically, it has to do with the corruption that's happening in the dark forest Yunara passed through, where she even ended up getting chased by a group of sinister, shadowy deer. And we can actually get a better look at what those creatures look like now, since Riot released the concept material for that cinematic a while ago. We also have the lore for the corrupted Petricite skins for Maokai and Xerath to check out. Maokai says the following: "Though this ancient tree once stood resplendent in some forgotten Petricite grove, the sudden bloom of wild magic has animated its branches and heartwood anew. It now lumbers far and wide, fiercely protecting its enchanted seedlings from the growing Demacian settlements encroaching upon the wildwoods." What's interesting here is that this Maokai lore references the story of Gavid the Plant King, a champion who was actually developed at one point but ended up being cancelled. In his lore, Demacia had devastated a large part of the forest and killed many of Gavid's plant relatives and companions with their brutal axes. Now, about Xerath's lore, it says the following: "Even the most wondrous works of Duran's masonry may warp if the Petricite absorbs too much magic. This statue was raised by Demacians in times past to honor their beloved winged protectors, yet now it crackles with unpredictable arcane energies, a new threat against those who were built to protect it." It's worth pointing out, when objects infused with Petricite absorb enough magic, their forms can transform. They can even change color. And in this example on the screen, we can actually see the metamorphic properties of items infused with Petricite when they come into contact with magic. When an overflow happens, Petricite basically ends up becoming a magical object in a way, because instead of retaining magic, it starts releasing it. These transformation properties were observed by the first Demacian sculptors, like Durand, and were later reused in the construction of golems, which were as durable as stone and at the time able to move freely without difficulty, as long as they absorbed enough magic. Now, what could be the source of this dark magic we can see in the Xerath and Maokai skin? In my opinion, based on the leaks about Locke and the theory I've been putting together, we're probably dealing with something related to some kind of primordial demon. When Big Bad Bear talked about Locke's kit, he mentioned sigils, pacts, and a 1,000-year seal, so it's very likely that this primordial demon was trapped and contained in that forest. But its magic was so powerful that over the centuries, all that Petricite that might exist in the soil and the surrounding areas ended up becoming overloaded. And because of that, it started contaminating the local fauna and flora. That would explain the appearance of those shadowy deer, or even the sinister aesthetic of the vegetation itself. In the comic For the Fallen, we see Locke himself, completely hooded inside an inn called Raptor's Rest Inn. He's asking the innkeeper questions about the forest, and she tells him that no one has ever come back from that place after venturing inside, at least not the same way. In other words, the ones who survive end up mentally disturbed, or something just as bad. From what Big Bad Bear has said, Locke is a type of occultist who hunts evil things, and what he's looking for is inside that forest. If it really is a primordial demon, is he planning to subdue it and use its power, like Neela with Ashlesh? Or is it revenge, like Vayne with Evelyn? Also, you know that moment when the darkness moves past the monument of the Veiled Lady and travels towards the city where it starts attacking the inhabitants and pulling them away? I said in my analysis video that this was the work of Nocturne. Anyone who understands even a little bit about the lore said the same thing, because it really does look a lot like his ultimate. And Nocturne was sealed in Demacia because, according to legend, Fossen Groundguard, the great-grandfather of Lux and Garen, confronted Nocturne and sacrificed his own life, destroying that evil. He actually wounded Nocturne so badly that it put him into a coma-like state, but he remained inert until the fear of a young mage boy named Luca slowly awakened him, feeding him and allowing him to recover. All of this happens in the short story for Demacia, and at the end, Lux kind of exorcises Nocturne, who is possessing the boy's body, by using her elemental light magic. That allows Nocturne to be expelled, escaping to who knows where. And man, I really thought it'd come back in that cinematic, but the entire timeline of League has been going through a lot of retcons because Arcane became the new main canon of the story. Lux at the time of that story was 19 years old, but in the current timeline, we're still still in the past where she's only 14, so that means Nocturne is still dormant. And on the wiki, in the section that lists every champion who appears in or isn't mentioned in the cinematic, Nocturne isn't listed. So yeah, it wasn't his doing. We accused and judged poor Noc unfairly, just because we saw a wave of darkness full of demonic shadows capturing people to feed on them and possibly kill them. Now, either way, I believe we're not going to get a new region in Season 2, and my guess is that we'll stay in Demacia, because if you remember, both Season 2 and Season 3 of 2025 happened in Ionia, with Yunara as the champion, then the Xin Zhao rework, and then to finish it off, the release of Zahen. But it could also end up not being that. For now, the only thing left to do is to wait and hope that Locke really surprises us, and that it's not just more of the same, even though what has already been leaked about him has created huge expectations and a lot of hype for his release. The third season, Shurima or a project event. Let's start this topic by highlighting another part of the dev update.
Will this year have a year-long narrative?
Every year is going to be different. There will be some connection between seasons 1 and 2 this year, but not so much as last year. Season 3 will be more standalone, and you're going to see why it's going to make sense later in the year.
The third season, Pabro said, will be completely independent and won't have connections to the first and second seasons. So yeah, that means no more Demacia, Locke, or all that corruption stuff. But where are we going then? I'm going to start with one possible option, based on what that guy said in the video and on the leak that Big Bad Bear brought up last year. In this case, it was about Riot asking players if they wanted an entire season dedicated to skin universes like Star Guardian, High Noon, and Project. I don't remember which of his videos it was, but there was mention that this skin line could return this year, and I'm pretty sure about that. There was even talk about LeBlanc and Quinn getting Project skins, and Master Yi getting some kind of variant for the legendary skin he already has. And honestly, it makes sense for Riot to use a popular skin line to fill the gap until 2027, when League Next should arrive. I just don't know if they could create a new game mode or minigame for that theme, especially since everyone is already focused on developing the new client. But now that I think about it, the Project universe actually did get its own map and game mode. This footage you're seeing in the background was shown by the Skin Spotlight channel back on November 6th, 2017. Out of all of the maps and game modes we've ever had, this one is probably one of the least popular. It's barely remembered, but Riot could definitely reuse it and add new features to make it more interesting, keeping players busy and satisfied. But if the season isn't focused on the Project universe, there are also a lot of hints that it might go to Shurima, and that Zahen could end up being one of the protagonists, or at least one of the main characters involved. Oh yeah, what kind of proof do you have? Well, if we go to the article from the Rioters responsible for creating Zahen, Rioter Issa Mari Orchidian de Leon, who works as a narrative writer at Riot Games, reveals that she was responsible for Zahen's story. And if we scroll down through the many questions that were asked there, we find two really important ones from a user named Unruly Cow. The first one asks about a possible interaction between Zahen and Xerath, what he thinks about the whole situation involving Azir's betrayal, the consequences that came from it, and where Zahen stands in all of this, considering he was a Sun Priest and led several chosen people through the Ascension ritual. The answer to that question was that in the earlier narrative draft, there actually would have been an interaction between them, and that Zahen would have said something about Xerath ruling over nothing but ruins, while also having a very negative opinion of him, obviously. The second one starts by mentioning the interaction Zahen has with Azir, which feels more like a correction of behavior and posture. Then the question asks whether Zahen would eventually side with Azir in order to help rebuild the Shuriman Empire and put it back on track, or if he is more concerned with his current condition, meaning the fact that he possessed a mortal body and is still dealing with that. The answer was that Zahen's current interaction with Azir is basically Zahen wanting Azir to act and behave like a true emperor. Only then would Zahen recognize him as a worthy ruler and be loyal to him. Orchidian also confirmed that yes, everything related to his current state after possessing a mortal and deciding to return to the world, along with the fact that the Darken are now roaming free again, is what Zahen prioritizes the most right now. But back when Zahen was still being designed as a support, one of the narrative ideas they tested was that he would return to Shurima to swear loyalty once again to Azir and the Shuriman Empire. However, that version of Zahen had much more aggressive personality and didn't have the calm and melancholic state he has now. Because of that, they decided to change the direction. Even so, they liked that idea enough to keep it as a sort of homage, and also as an indication of the kind of loyalty Zahen still carries with him.
Rise, Hawk Emperor. I pledge no loyalty to an unfit leader.
And man, I really doubt that Zahin would still remain in the Temple of Twilight or with the Kinku Order after the events of the cinematic Twilight's end. In his own lines, he makes it clear to Nasus that the two of them can't remain secluded in their grief anymore, which implies that the time to act has arrived.
We cannot bar ourselves from the world any longer, Scholar.
He also makes his new objective pretty clear.
I will see beyond our madness. I will rise above all that has broken our minds. Steel the mind, temper the flesh, hunt the fallen. I do not wake an ancient war merely to fight it, but to end it.
But that doesn't mean Zahin will simply show up and immediately side with Azir or any other god warrior, because he also says the following.
Our allegiance must still be proven, god warrior.
It's also worth pointing out that Zahin isn't hunting his brothers out of revenge, madness, or anything like that. He actually feels largely responsible for what happened to them, and now believes that he has to finally bring this whole Darken situation to an end after everything they've taken from the world. It's almost like an act of compassion that's necessary if Runeterra is ever going to find peace.
For who you were, for who you must be again.
And it's possible that this doesn't apply to every Darken, because Zahin also gives his brothers and sisters a chance to prove themselves, to see if they're worthy staying alive and redeeming themselves.
My kin, show me you deserve to stand.
Because if having Zahin at Azir's side would already give him a massive advantage in the war against Xerath happening in Shurima, imagine also having some redeemed Darken forming a new battalion of warrior gods. In Legends of Runeterra, Varus actually follows this idea. In the description of his level 1 card, it says, "What if, over time, the man that had become the Darken remembered himself, prompted by the mortal voices within? What if, instead of overcoming those voices entirely, he came to believe in them?" And in level 2, this idea goes even deeper, because it says, Varus was empowered, bolstered, reminded of who he was and what he has yet to become. He embraced the sum of his parts instead of working against them, and when they acted as one. I don't rule out that possibility. Another thing I also don't rule out is that if Season 3 really takes place in Shurima, the rework we might get could be Amumu. I seriously doubt it would be Rammus. He's basically perfectly okay as he is, and that's the whole charm of the character. At most, maybe just a visual upgrade. Amumu, on the other hand, could finally stop looking like a kid wearing a mummy costume made out of toilet paper and actually start looking more like a Yordle. And I don't think they would change his gameplay too much either. Maybe one ability at most, or some kind of adjustment to his passive. Who knows, maybe when we get closer to MSI, or even after it, we'll see some kind of leak about which champion is getting the rework, and which region Season 3 will take place in. But I'm still sticking with my bet on Shurima, because it wouldn't make much sense for Riot to start continuing these stories, and then just leave Zahin aside right after he returned. And yeah, I know the seasons aren't supposed to be connected, but I think that even with Zahin inside Xin Zhao's body, it wouldn't necessarily create direct ties to Season 1 and Season 2. And just so you have an idea, in the comic Spearhead, we see Yunara and Demacia remembering Zahin in a brief moment, when she looks at the Demacian Silverwing. In several other parts, she keeps thinking about Zahin, now that he has returned and walks in the world once again. And at the end, she even looks at Xin Zhao's armor in her quarters, asking that Zahin honor his sacrifice by proving himself worthy of it. And even though we already know Season 3 won't introduce a new champion, it would still be interesting if it stretched into early next year and Riot finally giving us an ascended champion. Or even better, a Bakai, because the only one we currently have in the game is Xerath. And the interesting thing is that several Bakai have already appeared in different places. In Varus' short story Dark Kin, at one point during his journey back to Shurima after being freed, Varus encounters a creature with an atrophied arm and bird-like features. Based on that description, the wiki believes it's not a Vastaya, but actually a Bakai. There's also a really cool post from Legends of Runeterra Brazil talking about the Bakai. What's interesting is that it explains that the Bakai who survive usually take refuge in tombs, where they live while protecting them from raiders, wearing masks that evoke funerary rites and robes that hide their animal-like traits and features. And we've had several really cool Bakai cards in-game, including Rampaging Bakai, Forsaken Bakai, Bakai Reaper, Bakai Witherclaw, Claw, Sand Spinner, and Sanctum Conservator. And man, imagine how insane it would be if Azir actually summoned the Bakai. Even though they aren't perfect and are seen as flawed gods, he could interrogate them into his army just to gain even more advantage against Xerath. Of course, he would have to swallow a lot of his ego and pride to make that kind of call, accepting that he would need the help of the imperfect in order to make Shurima perfect again. Something that I honestly really doubt would happen, but it's still fun to think about. But yeah, that's basically it. I'll see you guys in the next video.